Is A Quiet Place Day One really a horror film? Well, what defines a horror film? The jump scares? The need for some type of monster on the hunt? An eerie atmosphere? Low-lit domestic locations like dark basements at night or haunted houses? Or should it have an isolated setting? Forests, small towns, lighthouses, communes, and the like. Is a horror film defined by how it ends? Most horror films inevitably have the main characters try to defeat the monster head-on. Usually the main characters win, though often the monster is never truly beaten. There is always some kind of indication that the monster will be a threat to some individual or individuals again. For the sequel, of course. A lot of horror films follow this formula, but after a while, you gotta admit, the formula gets boring. Which is why A Quiet Place as a franchise is such a curio. Where the typical horror film relies on the characters screaming and freaking out, the very premise of A Quiet Place restricts that element of horror. However, A Quiet Place Day One, the prequel to A Quiet Place 1 and 2, falls even further outside the typical tropes of the horror film. So much so, the question becomes, is Day One even a horror film anymore? And if not, what is it? And while we're on the subject, is it good? But before we get to all that, quick premise rundown. The film follows Sam, played by Lupita Nyong'o, a terminally ill, depressed woman living in New York at the start of an alien invasion. The people quickly realize that these aliens are incredibly sensitive to sound. Throughout the course of several of these first days, we follow Sam's effort to survive and her interaction with other survivors, including Eric, an anxious British lawyer who decides to follow Sam, despite her reluctance. Nyong'o's performance is highly expressive, which I suppose you have to be with the necessarily limited dialogue, and her balance between resilience and vulnerability is done in a way that is very believable. But Joseph Quinn, playing Eric, really is my highlight performance. Where you'd expect the main male lead to be heroic and stoic, Eric is anxious and fretful, which Quinn does brilliantly. His emotions are writ all over his face and body language, which makes various acts of heroics more meaningful and important, really applying the adage that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. Speaking of the setting, if you've watched the previous two films, then the premise is not new to you, but like I alluded to before, Day One is a bit of a departure from the previous movies. The domestic, isolated setting has been swapped for the crowded cityscape, and the perspective of the story is not contained to the main characters per se. The main characters in Day One are perceived in the wider context of society trying to survive an overwhelming hostile force. Altogether, Day One has closer affinity to monster movies of the likes of Godzilla or Cloverfield. In fact, A Quiet Place was first envisioned as a new entry within the Cloverfield universe. Now, a monster movie can often be seen as a subgenre of horror, though that is depending on whether other elements of the film add to that horror categorization. However, I feel that Day One removes itself further from the horror genre through its focus of terror, not horror. Seeing as this is being billed as a horror movie, this is not entirely great, but it's not entirely bad either. Let me explain. There are various theories about the difference between terror and horror, but to put it simply, horror is being shocked and scared as a result of a distressing occurrence, and terror is the state of being anxious or fearful in anticipation of something dreadful occurring. Where most horror films incorporate fearful anticipation in their narrative, especially at the start of the story, horror, seeing it on your high school lawn slowly approaching you, watching the creepy girl levitate, being chased by a masked madman with a chainsaw, is what dominates the atmosphere of the movie. Day One, in fact, utilizes a surprisingly little amount of horror, adding with the lack of audible frenzy that brings a sense of horror. The jump scares, which are already not very many, loses their potency in Day One, simply because they are expected. A normal jump scare is horrifying because it suddenly brings the distressing occurrence into view. Suddenly, a red demon appears behind the husband in the film Insidious, for example. In Day One, the jump scares were not that effective because we were generally aware when the monsters will appear. That is, whenever the characters make a noise. What we didn't know is when they were going to make a noise, which is anticipatory anxiety, a function of terror, not horror. The capacity for horror is further reduced by the lack of blood or gore being shown. Where you'd expect to be stumbling upon mangled body after mangled body, the streets of New York are unbelievably empty. All in all, Day One is simply not that scary. Does that mean that Day One is a bad horror film? Well, arguably, yes. But does that mean that Day One is a bad film? Not necessarily, and personally, I don't think so. When looking at the themes, the biggest sense of terror found in the film is not really from the aliens, not in isolation. It's rather Sam's fear of dying unfulfilled. At the start of the film, Sam feels out of control and helpless due to her terminal cancer diagnosis, robbing her of all the aspects of her life that she used to enjoy. She stopped writing poetry, stopped visiting New York City, and kept her relationships at arm's length. So when the aliens invade, and Sam decides that she wants to make the trip to a pizza place from her childhood that she's been wanting to visit, the feeling of dread comes from the fear that Sam will die before she makes it. In this way, the stakes are less rational and more sentimental. The film's main focus is the emotional journey that Sam experiences as she slowly makes efforts to take control of her own fate and the freedom that comes by not letting her cancer define her. And Day One does do well in following Sam along this journey as she slowly starts to defy the idea that having cancer means just surviving up until dying rather than living life to the fullest. The fact that this film could have gotten rid of all the monsters and still have very similar narrative beats does not negate the film's strong emotional power, though it does make it a bad horror film, if you even can call it a horror film at all. If I were to categorize it as a sci-fi disaster film, then A Quiet Place Day One is actually pretty enjoyable and deserves a watch. Just don't expect to be scared of the aliens. Instead, be scared of the true monster of the film, wasting your life doing nothing of value.